Chapter 29. Mrs. Flintwich goes on dreaming. The house in the city preserved its heavy dullness through all these transactions, and the invalid within it turned the same unvarying round of life. Morning, noon, and night, each recurring with its accompanying monotony, always the same reluctant return of the same sequences of machinery, like a dragging piece of clockwork. The wheeled chair had its associated remembrances and reveries, one may suppose, at every place that is made the station of a human being has. Pictures of demolished streets and altered houses, as they formerly were when the occupant of the chair was familiar with them, images of people as they too used to be, with little or no allowance made for the lapse of time since they were seen. Of these there must have been many in the long routine of gloomy days. To stop the clock of busy existence at the hour when we were personally sequestered from it, to suppose mankind stricken motionless when we were brought to a standstill, to be unable to measure the changes beyond our view by any larger standard than the shrunken one of our own uniform and contracted existence, is the infirmity of many invalids, and the mental unhealthiness of almost all recluses. What scenes and actors the stern woman most reviewed, as she sat from season to season in her one dark room, none knew but herself. Mr. Flintwich, with his wry presence brought to bear upon her daily like some eccentric mechanical force, would perhaps have screwed it out of her, if there had been less resistance in her, but she was too strong for him. So far as Mistress Affery was concerned, to regard her liege lord and her disabled mistress with a face of blank wonder, to go about the house after dark with her apron over her head, always to listen for the strange noises and sometimes to hear them, and never to emerge from her ghostly, dreamy, sleep-waking state, was occupation enough for her. There was a fair stroke of business doing, as Mistress Affery made out, for her husband had abundant occupation in his little office, and saw more people than had been used to come there for some years. This might easily be, the house having been long deserted, but he did receive letters and comers, and keep books and correspond. Moreover, he went about to other counting-houses, and to wharves and docks, and to the custom-house, and to Garraway's coffee-house, and the Jerusalem coffee-house, and on 'change, so that he was much in and out. He began, too, sometimes of an evening, when Mrs. Clennam expressed no particular wish for his society, to resort to a tavern in the neighbourhood, to look at the shipping news and closing prices in the evening paper, and even to exchange small socialities with mercantile sea captains who frequented that establishment. At some period of every day he and Mrs. Clennam held a council on matters of business, and it appeared to Affery, who was always groping about, listening and watching, that the two clever ones were making money. The state of mind into which Mr. Flintwich's dazed lady had fallen had now begun to be so expressed in all her looks and actions that she was held in very low account by the two clever ones, as a person never of strong intellect, who was becoming foolish. Perhaps because her appearance was not of a commercial cast, or perhaps because it occurred to him that his having taken her to wife might expose his judgment to doubt in the minds of customers, Mr. Flintwich laid his commands upon her that she should hold her peace on the subject of her conjugal relations, and should no longer call him Jeremiah out of the domestic trio. Her frequent forgetfulness of this admonition intensified her startled manner, since Mr. Flintwich's habit of avenging himself on her reminiscences by making springs after her on the staircase and shaking her occasioned her to be always nervously uncertain when she might be thus waylaid next. Little Dorrit had finished a long day's work in Mrs. Clennam's room, and was neatly gathering up her shreds and odds and ends before going home. Mr. Panks, whom Affery had just shown in, was addressing an inquiry to Mrs. Clennam on the subject of her health, coupled with the remark that, happening to find himself in that direction, he had looked in to inquire on behalf of his proprietor how she found herself. Mrs. Clennam, with a deep contraction of her brows, was looking at him. "Mr. Casby knows," said she, that I am not subject to changes. The change that I await here is the great change." "Indeed, ma'am," returned Mr. Panks, with a wandering eye towards the figure of the little seamstress on her knee, picking threads and fraying of her work from the carpet. "You look nicely, ma'am." "I bear what I have to bear," she answered. "Do what you have to do." "Thank you, ma'am," said Mr. Panks. "Such is my endeavour." "You are often in this direction, are you not?" asked Mrs. Clennam. "Why, yes, ma'am," said Panks. "Rather so lately. I have lately been round this way a good deal, owing to one thing and another." "Beg Mr. Caseby and his daughter not to trouble themselves by deputy about me. When they wish to see me, they know I am here to see them. They have no need to trouble themselves to send. You have no need to trouble yourself to come." "Not the least trouble, ma'am," said Mr. Panks. "You really are looking uncommonly nicely, ma'am." "Thank you. Good evening." The dismissal and its accompanying finger pointed straight to the door was so curt and direct that Mr. Panks did not see his way to prolong his visit. He stirred up his hair with his sprightliest expression, glanced at the little figure again, said, "Good evening, ma'am. Don't come down, Mrs. Affrey. I know the road to the door," and steamed out. Mrs. Clennam, her chin resting on her hand, followed him with attentive and darkly distrustful eyes, and Affrey stood looking at her as if she were spellbound. Slowly and thoughtfully Mrs. Clennam's eyes turned from the door by which Panks had gone out to little Dorrit, rising from the carpet. With her chin drooping more heavily on her hand, and her eyes vigilant and lowering, the sick woman sat looking at her until she attracted her attention. Little Dorrit coloured under such a gaze and looked down. Mrs. Clennam still sat intent. "Little Dorrit," she said, when she at last broke silence, "what do you know of that man?" "I don't know anything of him, ma'am, except that I have seen him about, and that he has spoken to me." "What has he said to you?" "I don't understand what he has said. He is so strange, but nothing rough or disagreeable." "Why does he come here to see you?" "I don't know, ma'am," said little Dorrit with perfect frankness. "You know that he does come here to see you?" "I have fancied so," said little Dorrit, "but why he should come here or anywhere for that, ma'am, I can't think." Mrs. Clennam cast her eyes towards the ground, and with her strong set face, as intent upon a subject in her mind as it had lately been upon the form that seemed to pass out of her view, sat absorbed. Some minutes elapsed before she came out of this thoughtfulness and resumed her hard composure. Little Dorrit, in the meanwhile, had been waiting to go, but afraid to disturb her by moving. She now ventured to leave the spot where she had been standing since she had risen, and to pass gently round by the wheeled chair. She stopped at its side to say, "Good night, ma'am." Mrs. Clennam put out her hand and laid it on her arm. Little Dorrit, confused under the touch, stood faltering. Perhaps some momentary recollection of the story of the princess may have been in her mind. "Tell me, Little Dorrit," said Mrs. Clennam, "have you many friends now?" "Very few, ma'am. Besides you, only Miss Flora and one more." "Meaning?" said Mrs. Clennam, with her unbent finger again pointing to the door. "That man?" "Oh, no, ma'am." "Some friend of his, perhaps?" "No, ma'am." Little Dorrit earnestly shook her head. "Oh, no, no one at all like him or belonging to him." "Well," said Mrs. Clennam, almost smiling, "it is no affair of mine. I ask because I take an interest in you, and because I believe I was your friend when you had no other who could serve you. Is that so?" "Yes, ma'am, indeed it is. I have been here many a time when, but for you and the work you gave me, we would have wanted everything." "We," repeated Mrs. Clennam, looking towards the watch, once her dead husband's, which always lay upon her table. "Are there many of you?" "Only father and I now. I mean only father and I to keep regularly out of what we get." "Have you undergone any privations, you and your father, and who else there may be of you?" asked Mrs. Clennam, speaking deliberately and meditatively, turning the watch over and over. Sometimes it has been rather hard to live, said Little Dorrit, in her soft voice and timid, uncomplaining way. But I think not harder, as to that many people find it. That's well said, Mrs. Clennam quickly returned. That's the truth. You are a good, thoughtful girl. You are a grateful girl, too, or I much mistake you. It is only natural to be that. There is no merit in being that, said Little Dorrit. I am indeed. Mrs. Clennam, with a gentleness of which the dreaming Affery had never dreamed her to be capable, drew down the face of her little seamstress and kissed her on the forehead. Now go, Little Dorrit, said she, or you will be late, poor child. In all the dreams Mistress Affery had been piling up since she first became devoted to the pursuit, she had dreamed nothing more astonishing than this. Her head ached with the idea that she would find the other clever one kissing Little Dorrit next, and then the two clever ones embracing each other and dissolving into tears of tenderness for all mankind. The idea quite stunned her, as she attended the light footsteps down the stairs, that the house door might be safely shut. On opening it to let Little Dorrit out, she found Mr. Panks, instead of having gone his way, as in any less wonderful place and among less wonderful phenomena he might have been reasonably expected to do, fluttering up and down the court outside the house. The moment he saw Little Dorrit, he passed her briskly, said with his finger to his nose, as Mrs. Affery distinctly heard, "Panks the gipsy fortune-telling," and went away. "Lord save us, here's a gipsy and a fortune-teller in it now," cried Mistress Affery. "What next?" She stood at the open door, staggering herself with this enigma on a rainy, thundery evening. The clouds were flying fast, and the wind was coming up in gusts, banging some neighbouring shutters that had broken loose, twirling the rusty chimney-cowls and weathercocks, and rushing round and round a confined adjacent churchyard, as if it had a mind to blow the dead citizens out of their graves. The low thunder, muttering in all quarters of the sky at once, seemed to threaten vengeance for this attempted desecration, and to mutter, "Let them rest, let them rest." Mistress Affery, whose fear of thunder and lightning was only to be equalled by her dread of the haunted house with a premature and preternatural darkness in it, stood undecided whether to go in or not, until the question was settled for her by the door blowing upon her in a violent gust of wind and shutting her out. "What's to be done now? What's to be done now?" cried Mistress Affery, wringing her hands in this last uneasy dream of all, "when she's all alone by herself inside, and can no more come down to open it than the churchyard dead themselves." In this dilemma, Mistress Affery, with her apron as a hood to keep the rain off, ran crying up and down the solitary paved enclosure several times. Why she should then stoop down and look in at the keyhole of the door, as if an eye would open it, it would be difficult to say, but it is none the less what most people would have done in the same situation, and it is what she did. From this posture she started up suddenly, with a half-scream, feeling something on her shoulder. It was the touch of a hand, of a man's hand. The man was dressed like a traveller, in a foraging cap with fur about it and a heap of cloak. He looked like a foreigner. He had a quantity of hair and moustache, jet black except at the shaggy ends, where it had a tinge of red, and a high hook nose. He laughed at Mistress Affery's start and cry, and as he laughed, his moustache went up under his nose, and his nose came down over his moustache. "What's the matter?" he asked in plain English. "What are you frightened at?" "At you," panted Affery. "Me, madam?" "And the dismal evening, and everything," said Affery. "And here, the wind has been and blown the door to, and I can't get in." "Ah," said the gentleman, who took that very coolly. "Indeed, do you know such a name as Clennam about here?" "Lord bless us, I should think I did, I should think I did," cried Affery, exasperated into a new wringing of hands by the inquiry. "Where about here?" "Where?" cried Affery, goaded into another inspection of the keyhole. "Where but here in this house? And she's all alone in her room, and lost the use of her limbs, and can't stir to help herself or me, and t'other clever one's out, and Lord forgive me," cried Affery, driven into a frantic dance by these accumulated considerations, if I ain't a-going headlong out of my mind. Taking a warmer view of the matter now that it concerned himself, the gentleman stepped back to glance at the house, and his eye soon rested on the long, narrow window of the little room near the hall door. "Where may the lady be who lost the use of her limbs, madam?" he inquired, with that peculiar smile which Mistress Affery could not choose but keep her eyes upon. "Up there," said Affery, "them two windows." "Ah, I am of a fair size, but could not have the honour of presenting myself in that room without a ladder. Now, madam, frankly, frankness is a part of my character. Shall I open the door for you?" "Yes, bless you, sir, for a dear creature, and do it at once," cried Affery, "for she may be a-calling me at this very present minute, or may be setting herself afire and burning herself to death, or there's no knowing what may be happening to her, and me a-going out of my mind of thinking of it. Stay, my good madam." He restrained her impatience with a smooth white hand. "Business hours, I apprehend, are over for the day?" "Yes, yes, yes," cried Affery, "long ago." "Let me make, then, a fair proposal. Fairness is a part of my character. I am just landed from the packet-boat, as you may see." He showed her that his cloak was very wet, and that his boots were saturated with water. She had previously observed that he was dishevelled and sallow, as if from a rough voyage, and so chilled that he could not keep his teeth from chattering. "I am just landed from the packet-boat, madam, and have been delayed by the weather, the infernal weather. In consequence of this, madam, some necessary business that I should otherwise have transacted here within the regular hours, necessary business because money business, still remains to be done. Now, if you will fetch any authorized neighbouring somebody to do it in return for my opening the door, I'll open the door. If this arrangement should be objectionable, I'll—" And with the same smile he had made a significant feint of backing away. Mistress Affery, heartily glad to effect the proposed compromise, gave in her willing adhesion to it. The gentleman at once requested her to do him the favour of holding his cloak, took a short run at the narrow window, made a leap at the sill, clung his way up the bricks, and in a moment had his hand at the sash, raising it. His eyes looked so very sinister as he put his leg into the room and glanced round at Mistress Affery, that she thought with a sudden coldness, if he were to go straight upstairs to murder the invalid, what could she do to prevent him? Happily, he had no such purpose, for he reappeared in a moment at the house door. "Now, my dear madam," he said, as he took back his cloak and threw it on, "if you have the goodness to— What the devil's that?" The strangest of sounds, evidently close at hand from the peculiar shock it communicated to the air, yet subdued as if it were far off. A tremble, a rumble, and a fall of some light, dry matter. "What the devil is it?" "I don't know what it is, but I have heard the like of it over and over again," said Affery, who had caught his arm. He could hardly be a very brave man, even she thought in her dreamy start and fright, for his trembling lips had turned colourless. After listening a few moments, he made light of it. "Bah, nothing. Now, my dear madam, I think you spoke of some clever personage. Will you be so good as to confront me with that genius?" He held the door in his hand as though he were quite ready to shut her out again if she failed. "Don't you say anything about the door to me, then," whispered Affery. "Not a word. And don't you stir from here or speak if she calls while I run round the corner. Madam, I am a statue." Affery had so vivid a fear of his going stealthily upstairs the moment her back was turned, that after hurrying out of sight she returned to the gateway to peep at him. Seeing him still on the threshold, more out of the house than in it, as if he had no love for darkness and no desire to probe its mysteries, she flew into the next street and sent a message into the tavern to Mr. Flintwinch, who came out directly. The two returning together, the lady in advance and Mr. Flintwinch coming up briskly behind, animated with the hope of shaking her before she could get housed, saw the gentleman standing in the same place in the dark, and heard the strong voice of Mrs. Clennam calling from her room. "Who is it? What is it? Why does no one answer? Who is that down there?" Chapter 30. The Word of a Gentleman. When Mr. and Mrs. Flintwich panted up to the door of the old house in the twilight, Jeremiah within a second of Affery, the stranger started back. "Death of my soul!" he exclaimed. "Why, how did you get here?" Mr. Flintwich, to whom these words were spoken, repaid the stranger's wonder in full. He gazed at him with blank astonishment. He looked over his own shoulder as expecting to see someone he had not been aware of standing behind him. He gazed at the stranger again, speechlessly, at a loss to know what he meant. He looked at his wife for explanation. Receiving none, he pounced upon her and shook her with such heartiness that he shook her cap off her head, saying between his teeth with grim raillery as he did, "Affery, my woman, you must have a dose, my woman. This is some of your tricks. You have been dreaming again, mistress. What's it about? Who is it? What does it mean? Speak out or be choked. It's the only choice I'll give you." Supposing Mistress Affery to have any power of election at the moment, her choice was decidedly to be choked, for she answered not a syllable to this adjuration, but, with her bare head wagging violently backwards and forwards, resigned herself to her punishment. The stranger, however, picking up her cap with an air of gallantry, interposed. "Permit me," said he, laying his hand on the shoulder of Jeremiah, who stopped and released his victim. "Thank you. Excuse me. Husband and wife, I know, from this playfulness. Always agreeable to see that relation playfully maintained. Listen, may I suggest that somebody upstairs in the dark is becoming energetically curious to know what is going on here?" This reference to Mrs. Clennam's voice reminded Mr. Flintwich to step into the hall and call up the staircase. "It's all right, I am here. Affery is coming with your light." Then he said to the latter flustered woman, who was putting her cap on, "Get out with you and get upstairs," and then turned to the stranger and said to him, "Now, sir, what might you please to want?" "I am afraid," said the stranger, "I must be so troublesome as to propose a candle." "True," assented Jeremiah. "I was going to do so. Please to stand where you are while I get one." The visitor was standing in the doorway, but turned a little into the gloom of the house as Mr. Flintwich turned and pursued him with his eyes into the little room, where he groped about for a phosphorus box. When he found it, it was damp or otherwise out of order, and match after match that he struck into it lighted sufficiently to throw a dull glare about his groping face, and to sprinkle his hands with pale little spots of fire, but not sufficiently to light the candle. The stranger, taking advantage of this fitful illumination of his visage, looked intently and wonderingly at him. Jeremiah, when he at last lighted the candle, knew he had been doing this by seeing the last shade of a lowering watchfulness clear away from his face, as it broke into the doubtful smile that was a large ingredient in its expression. "Be so good," said Jeremiah, closing the house door and taking a pretty sharp survey of the smiling visitor in his turn, "as to step into my counting-house. It's all right, I tell you," petulantly breaking off to answer the voice upstairs, still unsatisfied, though Affery was there, speaking in persuasive tones. "Don't I tell you it's all right? Preserve the woman. Has she no reason at all in her?" "Timorous," remarked the stranger. "Timorous?" said Mr. Flintwich, turning his head to retort as he went before with the candle. "More courageous than 90 men in 100, sir, let me tell you." "Though an invalid?" "Many years an invalid, Mrs. Clennam. The only one of that name left in the house now. My partner," saying something apologetically as he crossed the hall, to the effect that at the time of night they were not in the habit of receiving anyone and were always shut up, Mr. Flintwich led the way into his own office, which presented a sufficiently business-like appearance. Here he put the light on his desk and said to the stranger with his wryest twist upon him, "Your commands?" "My name is Blondois." "Blondois? I don't know it," said Jeremiah. "I thought it possible," resumed the other, "that you might have been advised from Paris." We have had no advice from Paris respecting anybody of the name of Blondois, said Jeremiah. No? No. Jeremiah stood in his favourite attitude. The smiling Mr. Blondois, opening his cloak to get his hand to a breast pocket, paused to say, with a laugh in his glittering eyes, which it occurred to Mr. Flintwich were too near together, "You are so like a friend of mine. Not so identically the same as I supposed when I really did for the moment take you to be the same in the dusk, for which I ought to apologize. Permit me to do so. A readiness to confess my errors is, I hope, a part of the frankness of my character, still, however, uncommonly like." "Indeed," said Jeremiah perversely, "but I have not received any letter of advice from anywhere respecting anybody of the name of Blondois." "Just so," said the stranger. "Just so," said Jeremiah. Mr. Blondois, not at all put out by this omission on the part of the correspondents of the house of Clennam and Co., took his pocket-book from his breast-pocket, selected a letter from that receptacle, and handed it to Mr. Flintwich. "No doubt you are well acquainted with the writing. Perhaps the letter speaks for itself and requires no advice. You are a far more competent judge of affairs than I am. It is my misfortune to be not so much a man of business as what the world calls arbitrarily a gentleman." Mr. Flintwich took the letter and read, under date of Paris, "We have to present to you, on behalf of a highly esteemed correspondent of our firm, Mr. Blondois of this city, etc., etc. Such facilities as he may require and such attentions as may lie in your power, etc., etc. Also have to add that if you will honour Mr. Blondois' drafts at sight to the extent of, say, £50 sterling, 150, etc., etc." "Very good, sir," said Mr. Flintwich. "Take a chair. To the extent of anything that our house can do, we are in a retired, old-fashioned, steady way of business, sir. We shall be happy to render you our best assistance. I observe from the date of this that we could not yet be advised of it. Probably you came over with the delayed mail that brings the advice." "That I came over with the delayed mail, sir," returned Mr. Blondois, passing his white hand over his high-hooked nose. "I know to the cost of my head and stomach, the detestable and intolerable weather having racked them both. You see me in the plight in which I came out of the packet within this half-hour. I ought to have been here hours ago, and then I should not have to apologize. Permit me to apologize for presenting myself so unreasonably and frightening. No, by the by, you said not frightening. Permit me to apologize again. The esteemed lady, Mrs. Clennam, in her invalid chamber above stairs." Swagger and an air of authorized condescension do so much that Mr. Flintwich had already begun to think this a highly gentlemanly personage. Not the less unyielding with him on that account, he scraped his chin and said, what could he have the honour of doing for Mr. Blondois tonight, out of business hours? "Faith," returned that gentleman, shrugging his cloaked shoulders, "I must change, and eat, and drink, and be lodged somewhere. Have the kindness to advise me, a total stranger, where, and money is a matter of perfect indifference until tomorrow. The nearer the place, the better. Next door, if that's all." Mr. Flintwich was slowly beginning. "For a gentleman of your habits, there is not in this immediate neighbourhood any hotel," when Mr. Blondois took him up. "So much for my habits, my dear sir," snapping his fingers. "A citizen of the world has no habits. That I am, in my poor way, a gentleman, by heaven, I will not deny, but I have no unaccommodating prejudiced habits. A clean room, a hot dish for dinner, and a bottle of not absolutely poisonous wine are all I want tonight. But I want that much without the trouble of going one unnecessary inch to get it." "There is," said Mr. Flintwich, with more than his usual deliberation, as he met for a moment Mr. Blondois' shining eyes, which were restless, "there is a coffee-house and a tavern close here, which, so far as I can recommend, but there's no style about it." "I dispense with style," said Mr. Blondois, waving his hand. "Do me the honour to show me the house and introduce me there, if I am not too troublesome, and I shall be infinitely obliged." Mr. Flintwich, upon this, looked up his hat, and lighted Mr. Blondois across the hall again. As he put the candle on a bracket, where the dark old panelling almost served as an extinguisher for it, he bethought himself of going up to tell the invalid that he would not be absent 5 minutes. "Oblige me," said the visitor, on his saying so, "by presenting my card of visit. Do me the favour to add that I shall be happy to wait on Mrs. Clennam to offer my personal compliments, and to apologize for having occasioned any agitation in this tranquil corner, if it should suit her convenience to endure the presence of a stranger for a few minutes, after he shall have changed his wet clothes and fortified himself with something to eat and drink." Jeremiah made all dispatch and said, on his return, "She'll be glad to see you, sir, but being conscious that her sick room has no attractions, wishes me to say that she won't hold you to your offer in case you should think better of it." "To think better of it," returned the gallant Blondois, "would be to slight a lady. To slight a lady would be to be deficient in chivalry towards the sex, and chivalry towards the sex is a part of my character." Thus expressing himself, he threw the draggled skirt of his cloak over his shoulder, and accompanied Mr. Flintwinch to the tavern, taking up on the road a porter who was waiting with his portmanteau on the outer side of the gateway. The house was kept in a homely manner, and the condescension of Mr. Blondois was infinite. It seemed to fill to inconvenience the little bar in which the widow landlady and her 2 daughters received him. It was much too big for the narrow wainscoted room with a bagatelle board in it that was first proposed for his reception. It perfectly swamped the little private holiday sitting-room of the family, which was finally given up to him. Here, in dry clothes and scented linen, with sleeked hair, a great ring on each forefinger, and a massive show of watch-chain, Mr. Blondois, waiting for his dinner, lolling on a window-seat with his knees drawn up, looked, for all the difference in the setting of the jewel, fearfully and wonderfully like a certain Monsieur Rigaud, who had once so waited for his breakfast, lying on the stone ledge of the iron grating of a cell in a villainous dungeon at Marseilles. His greed at dinner, too, was closely in keeping with the greed of Monsieur Rigaud at breakfast. His avaricious manner of collecting all the eatables about him, and devouring some with his eyes while devouring others with his jaws, was the same manner. His utter disregard of other people, as shown in his way of tossing the little womanly toys of furniture about, flinging favourite cushions under his boots for a softer rest, and crushing delicate coverings with his big body and his great black head, had the same brute selfishness at the bottom of it. The softly moving hands that were so busy among the dishes had the old wicked facility of the hands that had clung to the bars, and when he could eat no more, and sat sucking his delicate fingers, one by one, and wiping them on a cloth, there wanted nothing but the substitution of vine leaves to finish the picture. On this man, with his moustache going up and his nose coming down in that most evil of smiles, and with his surface eyes looking as if they belonged to his dyed hair, and had had their natural power of reflecting light stopped by some similar process, nature, always true and never working in vain, had set the mark. Beware! It was not her fault if the warning were fruitless. She is never to blame in any such instance. Mr. Blondois, having finished his repast and cleaned his fingers, took a cigar from his pocket, and lying on the window-seat again, smoked it out at his leisure, occasionally apostrophizing the smoke as it parted from his thin lips in a thin stream. "Blondois shall turn the tables on society, my little child. Holy blue, you have begun well, Blondois. At a pinch, an excellent master in English or French, a man for the bosom of families. You have a quick perception, you have humour, you have ease, you have insinuating manners, you have a good appearance. In effect, you are a gentleman. A gentleman you shall live, my small boy, and a gentleman you shall die. You shall win, however the game goes. They shall all confess your merit, Blondois. You shall subdue the society which has grievously wronged you, to your own high spirit. Death of my soul, you are high-spirited by right and by nature, my Blondois." To such soothing murmurs did this gentleman smoke out his cigar and drink out his bottle of wine. Both being finished, he shook himself into a sitting attitude, and with the concluding serious apostrophe, "Hold, then, Blondois, you ingenious one, have all your wits about you," arose and went back to the house of Clennam and Co. He was received at the door by Mistress Affrey, who, under instructions from her lord, had lighted up 2 candles in the hall and a 3rd on the staircase, and who conducted him to Mrs. Clennam's room. Tea was prepared there, and such little company arrangements had been made as usually attended the reception of expected visitors. They were slight on the greatest occasion, never extending beyond the production of the China tea service and the covering of the bed with a sober and sad drapery. For the rest, there was the bier-like sofa with the block upon it, and the figure in the window's dress as if attired for execution, the fire topped by the mound of damped ashes, the grate with its second little mound of ashes, the kettle and the smell of black dye, all as they had been for 15 years. Mr. Flintwich presented the gentleman commended to the consideration of Clennam and Co. Mrs. Clennam, who had the letter lying before her, bent her head and requested him to sit. They looked very closely at one another. That was but natural curiosity. "I thank you, sir, for thinking of a disabled woman like me. Few who come here on business have any remembrance to bestow on one so removed from observation. It would be idle to expect that they should have. Out of sight, out of mind. While I am grateful for the exception, I don't complain of the rule." Mr. Blondois, in his most gentlemanly manner, was afraid he had disturbed her by unhappily presenting himself at such an unconscionable time, for which he had already offered his best apologies to Mr. He begged pardon, but by name had not the distinguished honour. "Mr. Flintwich has been connected with the house many years." Mr. Blondois was Mr. Flintwich's most obedient humble servant. He entreated Mr. Flintwich to receive the assurance of his profoundest consideration. "My husband being dead," said Mrs. Clennam, "and my son preferring another pursuit, our old house has no other representative in these days than Mr. Flintwich." "What do you call yourself?" was the surly demand of that gentleman. "You have the head of 2 men." "My sex disqualifies me," she proceeded with merely a slight turn of her eyes in Jeremiah's direction, "from taking a responsible part in the business, even if I had the ability, and therefore Mr. Flintwich combines my interest with his own and conducts it. It is not what it used to be, but some of our old friends, principally the writers of this letter, have the kindness not to forget us, and we retain the power of doing what they entrust to us as efficiently as we ever did. This, however, is not interesting to you." "You are English, sir?" "Faith, madam, no. I am neither born nor bred in England. In effect, I am of no country," said Mr. Blondois, stretching out his leg and smiting it. "I descend from 6 countries." "You have been much about the world?" "It is true. By heaven, madam, I have been here and there and everywhere." "You have no ties, probably, are not married?" "Madam," said Mr. Blondois, with an ugly fall of his eyebrows, "I adore your sex, but I am not married, never was." Mistress Affrey, who stood at the table near him, pouring out the tea, happened in her dreamy state to look at him as he said these words, and to fancy that she caught an expression in his eyes which attracted her own eyes so that she could not get them away. The effect of this fancy was to keep her staring at him with the teapot in her hand, not only to her own great uneasiness, but manifestly to his too, and, through them both, to Mrs. Clennam's and Mr. Flintwich's. Thus a few ghostly moments supervened, when they were all confusedly staring without knowing why. "Affrey," her mistress was the first to say, "what is the matter with you?" "I don't know," said Mistress Affrey, with her disengaged left hand extended towards the visitor. "It ain't me, it's him." "What does this good woman mean?" cried Mr. Blondois, turning white, hot, and slowly rising with a look of such deadly wrath that it contrasted surprisingly with the slight force of his words. "How is it possible to understand this good creature?" "It's not possible," said Mr. Flintwinch, screwing himself rapidly in that direction. "She don't know what she means. She's an idiot, a wanderer in her mind. She shall have a dose. She shall have such a dose. Get along with you, my woman," he added in her ear. "Get along with you while you know your Affery, and before you're shaken to yeast." Mistress Affery, sensible of the danger in which her identity stood, relinquished the teapot as her husband seized it, put her apron over her head, and in a twinkling vanished. The visitor gradually broke into a smile and sat down again. "You'll excuse her, Mr. Blondois," said Jeremiah, pouring out the tea himself. "She's failing and breaking up. That's what she's about. Do you take sugar, sir?" "Thank you. No tea for me. Pardon my observing it, but that's a very remarkable watch." The tea-table was drawn up near the sofa, with a small interval between it and Mrs. Clennam's own particular table. Mr. Blondois, in his gallantry, had risen to hand that lady her tea. Her dish of toast was already there, and it was in placing the cup conveniently within her reach that the watch, lying before her as it always did, attracted his attention. Mrs. Clennam looked suddenly up at him. "May I be permitted? Thank you. A fine old-fashioned watch," he said, taking it in his hand. "Heavy for use, but massive and genuine. I have a partiality for everything genuine. Such as I am genuine myself. Ha! A gentleman's watch, with 2 cases in the old fashion. May I remove it from the outer case? Thank you. Aye. An old silken watch-lining worked with beads. I have often seen these among old Dutch people and Belgians. Quaint things." "They are old-fashioned, too," said Mrs. Clennam. "Very. But this is not so old as the watch, I think." "I think not. Extraordinary how they used to complicate these ciphers," remarked Mr. Blondois, glancing up with his own smile again. "Now, is this D.N.F.? It might be almost anything." "Those are the letters." Mr. Flintwinch, who had been observantly pausing all this time with a cup of tea in his hand and his mouth open ready to swallow the contents, began to do so, always entirely filling his mouth before he emptied it at a gulp, and always deliberating again before he refilled it. "D.N.F. was some tender, lovely, fascinating fair creature, I make no doubt," observed Mr. Blondois, as he snapped on the case again. "I adore her memory on the assumption. Unfortunately for my peace of mind, I adore but too readily. It may be a vice, it may be a virtue, but adoration of female beauty and merit constitutes 3 parts of my character, madam." Mr. Flintwinch had by this time poured himself out another cup of tea, which he was swallowing in gulps as before, with his eyes directed to the invalid. "You may be heart-free here, sir," she returned to Mr. Blondois. "Those letters are not intended, I believe, for the initials of any name." "Of a motto, perhaps," said Mr. Blondois casually. "Of a sentence. They have always stood, I believe, for 'Do not forget.'" "And naturally," said Mr. Blondois, replacing the watch and stepping backward to his former chair, "you do not forget." Mr. Flintwinch, finishing his tea, not only took a longer gulp than he had taken yet, but made his succeeding pause under new circumstances, that is to say, with his head thrown back and his cup held still at his lips, while his eyes were still directed at the invalid. She had that force of face and that concentrated air of collecting her firmness or obstinacy, which represented in her case what would have been gesture and action in another, as she replied with a deliberate strength of speech. "No, sir, I do not forget. To lead a life as monotonous as mine has been during many years is not the way to forget. To lead a life of self-correction is not the way to forget. To be sensible of having, as we all have, every one of us, all the children of Adam, offences to expiate and peace to make, does not justify the desire to forget. Therefore I have long dismissed it, and I neither forget nor wish to forget." Mr. Flintwinch, who had latterly been shaking the sediment at the bottom of his teacup round and round, here gulped it down, and putting the cup in the tea-tray, as done with, turned his eyes upon Mr. Blondois, as if to ask what he thought of that. "All expressed, madame," said Mr. Blondois, with his smoothest bow and his white hand on his breast, "by the word naturally, which I am proud to have had sufficient apprehension and appreciation, but without appreciation I could not be Blondois to employ." "Pardon me, sir," she returned, "if I doubt the likelihood of a gentleman of pleasure and change and politeness, accustomed to court and to be courted." "Oh, madam, by heaven! If I doubt the likelihood of such a character quite comprehending what belongs to mine in my circumstances. Not to obtrude doctrine upon you," she looked at the rigid pile of hard pale books before her, "for you go your own way, and the consequences are on your own head. I will say this much, that I shape my course by pilots, strictly by proved and tried pilots, under whom I cannot be shipwrecked, cannot be, and that if I were unmindful of the admission conveyed in those 3 letters, I should not be half as chastened as I am." It was curious how she seized the occasion to argue with some invisible opponent, perhaps with her own better sense, always turning upon herself and her own deception. "If I forget my ignorances in my life of health and freedom, I might complain of the life to which I am now condemned. I never do. I never have done. If I forget that this scene, the earth, is expressly meant to be a scene of gloom and hardship and dark trial for the creatures who are made out of its dust, I might have some tenderness for its vanities. But I have no such tenderness. If I did not know that we are every one the subject, most justly the subject, of a wrath that must be satisfied, and against which mere actions are nothing, I might repine at the difference between me, imprisoned here, and the people who pass that gateway yonder. But I take it as a grace and favour to be elected to make the satisfaction I am making here, to know what I know for certain here, and to work out what I have worked out here. My affliction might otherwise have had no meaning to me. Hence I would forget, and I do forget, nothing. Hence I am contented, and say it is better with me than with millions." As she spoke these words, she put her hand upon the watch, and restored it to the precise spot on her little table which it always occupied. With her touch lingering upon it, she sat for some moments afterwards, looking at it steadily and half defiantly. Mr. Blondois, during this exposition, had been strictly attentive, keeping his eyes fastened on the lady, and thoughtfully stroking his moustache with his 2 hands. Mr. Flintwinch had been a little fidgety, and now struck in. There, said he. "That is quite understood, Mrs. Clennam, and you have spoken piously and well. Mr. Blondois, I suspect, is not of a pious caste." "On the contrary, sir," that gentleman protested, snapping his fingers. "Your pardon. It's a part of my character. I am sensitive, ardent, conscientious, and imaginative. A sensitive, ardent, conscientious, and imaginative man, Mr. Flintwinch, must be that, or nothing." There was an inkling of suspicion in Mr. Flintwinch's face that he might be nothing as he swaggered out of his chair. It was characteristic of this man, as it is of all men similarly marked, that whatever he did he overdid, though it were sometimes by only a hair's breadth, and approached to take his leave of Mrs. Clennam. "With what will appear to you the egotism of a sick old woman, sir," she then said, "though really through your accidental allusion I have been led away into the subject of myself and my infirmities. Being so considerate as to visit me, I hope you will be likewise so considerate as to overlook that. Don't compliment me, if you please." For he was evidently going to do it. "Mr. Flintwinch will be happy to render you any service, and I hope your stay in this city may prove agreeable." Mr. Blondois thanked her, and kissed his hand several times. "This is an old room," he remarked with a sudden sprightliness of manner, looking round when he got near the door. "I have been so interested that I have not observed it, but it's a genuine old room." "It's a genuine old house," said Mrs. Clennam with her frozen smile. "A place of no pretensions, but a piece of antiquity." "Faith," cried the visitor, "if Mr. Flintwinch would do me the favour to take me through the rooms on my way out, he could hardly oblige me more. An old house is a weakness with me. I have many weaknesses, but none greater. I love and study the picturesque in all its varieties. I have been called picturesque myself. It is no merit to be picturesque. I have greater merits, perhaps, but I may be, by an accident, sympathy. I tell you beforehand, Mr. Blondois, that you'll find it very dingy and very bare," said Jeremiah, taking up the candle. "It's not worth your looking at." But Mr. Blondois, smiting him in a friendly manner on the back, only laughed, so the said Blondois kissed his hand again to Mrs. Clennam, and they went out of the room together. "You don't care to go upstairs?" said Jeremiah on the landing. "On the contrary, Mr. Flintwinch, if not tiresome to you, I shall be ravished." Mr. Flintwinch, therefore, wormed himself up the staircase, and Mr. Blondois followed close. They ascended to the great garret bedroom which Arthur had occupied on the night of his return. "There, Mr. Blondois," said Jeremiah, showing it. "I hope you may think that worth coming so high to see. I confess I don't." Mr. Blondois being enraptured, they walked through other garrets and passages, and came down the staircase again. By this time Mr. Flintwinch had remarked that he never found the visitor looking at any room, after throwing one quick glance around, but always found the visitor looking at him, Mr. Flintwinch. With this discovery in his thoughts, he turned about on the staircase for another experiment. He met his eyes directly, and on the instant of their fixing one another, the visitor, with that ugly play of nose and moustache, laughed, as he had done at every similar moment since they left Mrs. Clennam's chamber, a diabolically silent laugh. As a much shorter man than the visitor, Mr. Flintwinch was at the physical disadvantage of being thus disagreeably leered at from a height, and as he went first down the staircase, and was usually a step or two lower than the other, this disadvantage was at the time increased. He postponed looking at Mr. Blondois again until this accidental inequality was removed by their having entered the late Mr. Clennam's room. But then, twisting himself suddenly round upon him, he found his look unchanged. "A most admirable old house," smiled Mr. Blondois. "So mysterious. Do you never hear any haunted noises here?" "Noises?" returned Mr. Flintwinch. "No." "Nor see any devils?" "Not," said Mr. Flintwinch, grimly screwing himself at his questioner, "not any that introduce themselves under that name and in that capacity." "Ha, ha! A portrait here, I see." Still looking at Mr. Flintwinch, as if he were the portrait. "It's a portrait, sir, as you observe." "May I ask the subject, Mr. Flintwinch?" "Mr. Clennam deceased, her husband." "Former owner of the remarkable watch, perhaps?" said the visitor. Mr. Flintwinch, who had cast his eyes towards the portrait, twisted himself about again, and again found himself the subject of the same look and smile. "Yes, Mr. Blondois," he replied tartly. "It was his, and his uncle's before him, and Lord knows who before him, and that's all I can tell you of its pedigree." "That's a strongly marked character, Mr. Flintwinch, our friend upstairs." "Yes, sir," said Jeremiah, twisting himself at the visitor again, as he did during the whole of this dialogue, like some screw machine that fell short of its grip, for the other never changed, and he always felt obliged to retreat a little. "She is a remarkable woman, great fortitude, great strength of mind. They must have been very happy," said Blondois. "Who?" demanded Mr. Flintwinch, with another screw at him. Mr. Blondois shook his right forefinger towards the sick-room, and his left forefinger towards the portrait, and then, putting his arms akimbo and striding his legs wide apart, stood smiling down at Mr. Flintwinch with the advancing nose and the retreating moustache. "As happy as most other married people, I suppose," returned Mr. Flintwinch. "I can't say. I don't know. There are secrets in all families." "Secrets?" cried Mr. Blondois quickly. "Say it again, my son." "I say," replied Mr. Flintwinch, upon whom he had swelled himself so suddenly that Mr. Flintwinch found his face almost brushed by the dilated chest. "I say, there are secrets in all families." "So there are," cried the other, clapping him on both shoulders and rolling him backwards and forwards. "Ha, ha, ha! You are right. So there are secrets. Holy blue, there are the devil's own secrets in some families, Mr. Flintwinch." With that, after clapping Mr. Flintwinch on both shoulders several times, as if in a friendly and humorous way he were rallying him on a joke he had made, he threw up his arms, threw back his head, hooked his hands together behind it, and burst into a roar of laughter. It was in vain for Mr. Flintwinch to try another screw at him. He had his laugh out. "But favour me with the candle a moment," he said, when he had done. "Let us have a look at the husband of the remarkable lady, holding up the light at arm's length. "A decided expression of face here, too, though not of the same character. Looks as if he were saying, what is it? 'Do not forget,' does he not, Mr. Flintwinch?" "By heaven, sir, he does." As he returned the candle, he looked at him once more, and then, leisurely strolling out with him into the hall, declared it to be a charming old house indeed, and one which had so greatly pleased him that he would not have missed inspecting it for £100. Throughout these singular freedoms on the part of Mr. Blondois, which involved a general alteration in his demeanour, making it much coarser and rougher, much more violent and audacious than before, Mr. Flintwinch, whose leathern face was not liable to many changes, preserved its immobility intact. Beyond now appearing perhaps to have been left hanging a trifle too long before that friendly operation of cutting down, he outwardly maintained an equable composure. They had brought their survey to a close in the little room at the side of the hall, and he stood there, eyeing Mr. Blondois. "I am glad you are well satisfied, sir," was his calm remark. "I didn't expect it. You seem to be quite in good spirits." "In admirable spirits," returned Blondois. "Word of honour, never more refreshed in spirits. Do you ever have presentiments, Mr. Flintwinch?" "I am not sure that I know what you mean by the term, sir," replied that gentleman. "Say, in this case, Mr. Flintwinch, undefined anticipations of pleasure to come." "I can't say I'm sensible of such a sensation at present," returned Mr. Flintwinch with the utmost gravity. "If I should find it coming on, I'll mention it." "Now said Blondois, "I, my son, have a presentiment tonight that we shall be well acquainted. Do you find it coming on?" No, returned Mr. Flintwinch, deliberately inquiring of himself. "I can't say I do." "I have a strong presentiment that we shall become intimately acquainted. You have no feeling of that sort yet?" "Not yet," said Mr. Flintwinch. Mr. Blondois, taking him by both shoulders again, rolled him about a little in his former merry way, then drew his arm through his own, and invited him to come off and drink a bottle of wine like a dear, deep old dog as he was. Without a moment's indecision, Mr. Flintwinch accepted the invitation, and they went out to the quarters where the traveller was lodged, through a heavy rain which had rattled on the windows, roofs, and pavements ever since nightfall. The thunder and lightning had long ago passed over, but the rain was furious. On their arrival at Mr. Blondois' room, a bottle of port wine was ordered by that gallant gentleman, who, crushing every pretty thing he could collect in the soft disposition of his dainty figure, coiled himself upon the window-seat, while Mr. Flintwinch took a chair opposite to him, with the table between them. Mr. Blondois proposed having the largest glasses in the house, to which Mr. Flintwinch assented. The bumpers filled. Mr. Blondois, with a roistering gaiety, clinked the top of his glass against the bottom of Mr. Flintwinch's, and the bottom of his glass against the top of Mr. Flintwinch's, and drank to the intimate acquaintance he foresaw. Mr. Flintwinch gravely pledged him and drank all the wine he could get and said nothing. As often as Mr. Blondois clinked glasses, which was at every replenishment, Mr. Flintwinch stolidly did his part for the clinking, and would have stolidly done his companion's part of the wine as well as his own, being, except in the article of palate, a mere cask. In short, Mr. Blondois found that to pour port wine into the reticent Flintwinch was, not to open him, but to shut him up. Moreover, he had the appearance of a perfect ability to go on all night, or, if occasion were, all next day and all next night, whereas Mr. Blondois soon grew indistinctly conscious of swaggering too fiercely and boastfully. He therefore terminated the entertainment at the end of the third bottle. "You will draw upon us tomorrow, sir?" said Mr. Flintwinch, with a business-like face at parting. "My cabbage," returned the other, taking him by the collar with both hands, "I'll draw upon you, have no fear. Adieu, my Flintwinch, receive at parting." Here he gave him a southern embrace, and kissed him soundly on both cheeks. "The word of a gentleman, by 1,000 thunders you shall see me again." He did not present himself next day, though the letter of advice came duly to hand. Inquiring after him at night, Mr. Flintwinch found, with surprise, that he had paid his bill and gone back to the Continent by way of Calais. Nevertheless, Jeremiah scraped out of his cogitating face a lively conviction that Mr. Blondois would keep his word on this occasion, and would be seen again. Chapter 31. Spirit. Anybody may pass, any day, in the thronged thoroughfares of the metropolis, some meagre, wrinkled, yellow old man, who might be supposed to have dropped from the stars if there were any star in the heavens dull enough to be suspected of casting off so feeble a spark, creeping along with a scared air, as though bewildered and a little frightened by the noise and bustle. This old man is always a little old man. If he were ever a big old man, he has shrunk into a little old man. If he were always a little old man, he has dwindled into a less old man. His coat is a collar and cut that never was the mode anywhere at any period. Clearly, it was not made for him, or for any individual mortal. Some wholesale contractor measured fate for 5,000 coats of such quality, and fate has lent this old coat to this old man, as one of a long unfinished line of many old men. It has always large, dull metal buttons, similar to no other buttons. This old man wears a hat, a thumbed and napless, and yet an obdurate hat, which has never adapted itself to the shape of his poor head. His coarse shirt and his coarse neckcloth have no more individuality than his coat and hat. They have the same character of not being his, of not being anybody's. Yet this old man wears these clothes with a certain unaccustomed air of being dressed and elaborated for the public ways, as though he passed the greater part of his time in a nightcap and gown, and so, like the country mouse in the second year of a famine, come to see the town mouse, and timidly threading his way to the town mouse's lodging through a city of cats, this old man passes in the streets. Sometimes, on holidays towards evening, he will be seen to walk with a slightly increased infirmity, and his old eyes will glimmer with a moist and marshy light. Then the little old man is drunk. A very small measure will overset him. He may be bowled off his unsteady legs with a half-pint pot. Some pitying acquaintance, chance acquaintance very often, has warmed up his weakness with a treat of beer, and the consequence will be the lapse of a longer time than usual before he shall pass again. For the little old man is going home to the workhouse, and on his good behaviour they do not let him out often, though methinks they might, considering the few years he has before him to go out in under the sun, and on his bad behaviour they shut him up closer than ever in a grove of 219 more old men, every one of whom smells of all the others. Mrs. Plawnish's father, a poor little reedy piping old gentleman, like a worn-out bird, who had been in what we called the music-binding business, and met with great misfortunes, and who had seldom been able to make his way, or to see it, or to pay it, or to do anything at all with it, but find it no thoroughfare, had retired of his own accord to the workhouse, which was appointed by law to be the good Samaritan of his district, without the 2 pence, which was bad political economy, on the settlement of that execution which had carried Mr. Plawnish to the Marshalsea College. Previous to his son-in-law's difficulties coming to that head, old Nandy, he was always so called in his legal retreat, but he was old Mr. Nandy among the bleeding hearts, had sat in a corner of the Plawnish fireside, and had taken his bite and sup out of the Plawnish cupboard. He still hoped to resume that domestic position when fortune should smile upon his son-in-law. In the meantime, while she preserved an immovable countenance, he was, and resolved to remain, one of these little old men in a grove of little old men, with a community of flavour. But no poverty in him, and no coat on him that never was the mode, and no old men's ward for his dwelling-place, could quench his daughter's admiration. Mrs. Plawnish was as proud of her father's talents as she could possibly have been if they had made him Lord Chancellor. She had as firm a belief in the sweetness and propriety of his manners as she could possibly have had if he had been Lord Chamberlain. The poor little old man knew some pale and vapid little songs, long out of date, about Chloe and Phyllis, and Strephon being wounded by the son of Venus, and for Mrs. Plawnish there was no such music at the opera as the small internal flutterings and chirpings wherein he would